there's all these cognitively blind and, let's say, people in mental wheelchairs which are trying to, as it were, gain access to the key issues of our day. So, can we build all these ramps and produce the braille and so on that will allow us to gain access to the things in question, let us say, in a coherent shape, in a shape um, uh, for those who haven't proceeded out of the current ground um, to the level of, let's say, Leo Strauss, or um, a place from which we can survey the character of the great thinkers such as Heidegger in some reasonable manner, such that we can pose questions to ourselves in some reasonable manner. I think this question of art, so the question of art was raised by Kristen Stewart in the recent Berlin film festival. Let me give some brief indication of why we should take that question profoundly and not regard it as in the way that we, as it were, have it from the received tradition from Kant's, Immanuel Kant's Critique on Taste, the third small critique. In the medieval period, we can represent the attitude towards what we now call art, and I think we see it through the lens of the 19th and maybe 18th century British category of the fine arts, so that we totally distinguish between art in the original sense of anything artificial, anything done by man, artisanal, which shows us the larger scope of that. The cord swain or leather worker, where Socrates used to hang out at the edge of the agora because the youth were not allowed to enter the agora, is often used as an example of technique or art in connection to the core of the tradition in Plato. But that covers anything done by human beings, so then ultimately including all scientific endeavors which are only distinguished from something like candle making, or anything done by the medieval corporations, hundreds of different things, making bedposts or matchsticks or lamps or a number of things needful for the community, by saying that some things can be done merely through the kind of physical imitation of what's happening, and other things require conceptual understanding. Conceptual understanding means then what's implied by saying, if, for instance, I look at a tree and then I say, this is the foundation of the tree stands on this, meaning the roots and the ground, and this is the crown, and the crown points up towards the air, but there's, according to the tradition, one would say that some kind of limitation has been put on how high trees grow. Then one might say, what if you conceptually switch that around and try to regard the crown as the foundation and the roots as the base? So then we get into the situation where we see the human mind is capable of using the concepts with which it grasps the world in such a way as to disorient the world, and sometimes this disorientation leads to spectacular results, as with Galileo's conceptual recasting, which is called the inertial frame of reference, by which he creates the modern physics, which was originally lambasted by the medieval universities because it was to treat the notion of a vacuum, which never really occurs properly in nature, as something which is occurring everywhere and at all times. So to argue either a rare case or an actually non-existent case against all the empirically known cases. Again, this led to spectacular results when, by total accident, I believe, it turned out that the mathematics was simpler to work for Copernicus to prove against all empirical proofs at the time that the Earth was moving around the sun, because, for instance, such proofs as were already given by Aristotle, that if that were the case, it would then seem that if we threw, or let's say projected something high up into the air, if the Earth is spinning towards the east at a very great rate, we should expect that thing to fall down somewhere to the west, whereas indeed it doesn't. And then an explanation is needed as to why that happens, which is not trivial, or, as it were, an explanation that makes sense from our normal point of view, but it was only sort of a little bit groped at already by Aristotle. But nonetheless, that was just one of the things that spoke against Copernicus's totally unempirical proof of something that then later on turned out to be empirically true. Whereas in the case of Galileo, we are still ongoing with something that isn't empirically true. The inertial frame of reference being spectacularly, as it were, successful. There is no such thing as a pure vacuum, is what I mean. Even though we can get a feather into something that weighs several tons to fall at almost the same rate according to our ability to measure, but not, as it were, precisely the same rate. So separating art from something that requires this conceptual art or technique, or things that can be imitated, from something that requires concepts and the confusion which comes from concepts, the four idols of the mind, I think Bacon describes them as, something like that. The confusion that comes from social confusion, the confusion that comes from different forms of casuistry in the pejorative sense of having a link in the long lines of reasonings fail, and different ways of going wrong that the enlightened world wanted to set aside by becoming more empirical. But then the question of what was constituted the edge of empiricism comes in. But let's not go into that just now, but let's only say art in this sense was distinguished from science through setting the conceptual world in a different substance, as it were, and the empirical world, the world of the senses on one side, the world of mathematics on another. And this is what we see breaking down in our own time. Okay, so we have this statement from Miss Stewart, which begins with the mention of Aristotle. We could talk about Aristotle's definition of art. We could talk about Roland Barthes' definition of art, Susan Sontag, Beavis and Butthead she mentions. So this shows the present way one moves, in a certain sense, just as a gloss, that one can give the popular voice, not just sort of sotto voce, not just sort of under the breath, but directly in the public discourse, is part of the attitude, part of the atmosphere that we move in. So, for instance, Zizek often says and not even completely tongue-in-cheek, that where we really learn about things is from the movies. But of course, this is partially due to the fact that he was under the Iron Curtain, and that the thaw period, the thaw generation, came maybe after he had already been directly exposed to the West a good deal through his college experience in the École Normale Supérieure. But so this is a strange development if you just think about it that way, but let's leave that aside. But the next statement that we have is from Kristen Stewart, is that art is can't be defined in this sense, but we know it when we see it. So this is the as it were, her namesake, Potter Stewart, the justice who ruled about the obscenity case in 1964, about a French film, has come out with this definition, which is unknown through the traditions of making the art totally in keeping with Kant's third critique as a matter of taste. Or totally subjective, as we see now. Then, at the end of her short remarks, she makes the remark that one. Well, wait a second. Let me go back for a second. What I was trying to establish before? In as clear shape as we can. Let's try to concentrate our attention on this. Is just that what role did art play, so far as we still understand it, basically in the way we say art, but not in any as the fine arts in the tradition, even though they didn't mainly understand it that way. Of course, in antiquity, there's this question about the taming the savage beast through the early education, through the paideia, through music, and through the tones mentioned in already as supposedly either a Dorian feature or somehow a feature that had been swept away by the degenerate period of the Athenian history. But in the striking example in the Middle Ages of Palestrina, the composer, who was meant to keep the access open to the Catholic thing, and played during the at church. The idea is here we have something which corresponds in a way to this debate over the idols. So there's this notion of the iconoclasm, is that there's somehow two categories. There's one thing is an icon, which can be understood as a vehicle, so it's something which can get you in the right mood to approach transcendence, or to approach God, or rather than something which is worshipped or adored in its own right. So there's one, I forget the exact terminology, but maybe it's adoration versus, it's something to do with either, if adoration means actually worshipping that thing, then that's wrong. I'm not sure. Adoration might be the term they used as a vehicle, but you see there's two terms. There's one that must mean actually worshipping that engraven image, or that idol, or that thing alongside other things. The other is using it as a vehicle to the transcendence. In this sense, Palestrina's music became controversial because it was a complex music using counterpoint, which later Beethoven was famous for in some of his later pieces. But the idea was that this is a vehicle, and it's a vehicle that also has extra meaning, that it brings masses which otherwise had no connection together, as Gesamtkunstwerk, as Wagner later called it, as a social work of art. So, all right, so caveat, I have to say, otherwise someone will say that I don't know what I'm talking about, but it's always wearisome to go through these things again and again, is that, okay, Wagner's term has been co-opted by, I think, first some architects, and now in the art world, so far as, somebody like Hans Ulrich Obrist and so on stands for the art world, then you always get this notion or if you're reading the London Financial Times or whatever, a newspaper that likes to use this sort of high culture intellectual terminology, which is now in play. You'll see the term Gesamtkunstwerk translated as total work of art, and then you'll see things like saying, look at the Chinese opera, how many different art forms come into the Chinese opera or whatever. So that's the most powerful usage. So just like the word ad hominem has been debased and is used by the American political class to mean insulting somebody, rather than what it originally meant, which was to provide a shared ground to somebody we're having a dialogic discussion with, and see if they would agree with it, so that from that shared ground we can have a conversation, so that the man themselves has agreed to this shared ground rather than speaking over ourselves all the time. That's the original. In proper sense of the ad hominem, it really means Socratic dialogic discussion. And of course, it has several other meanings, such as the genetic fallacy. But in the common, and also tailoring an argument, making a bespoke argument which pleases somebody and therefore can seduce them to say something false. But likewise, this history of terms then, of course, becomes important. This philologist work becomes important, and if we see that the Gesamtkunstwerk by Wagner and understood by Nietzsche in the discussions Nietzsche has criticizing Wagner, who in his early life was something of a idol for him, and in later he kind of denounced in a free way. We can see that the Gesamtkunstwerk meant something like this, Palestrina social work of art. It reminds a little bit of, also you had that the German artist Joseph Beuys came out with the social sculpture or whatever. That's a little bit on a similar idea. But basically Wagner was attempting within this Goethean notion of this infinity, the Freud mentions that verse, all unseen, the threads are knit together in infinite combination forms. This whole idea of the Faustian man in Spengler and so on as being the man that needs infinity. So the hard meaning of that we could connect to Keynesianism in a certain sense, because what it means is that the economy must always be growing, otherwise it falls apart. If it always must be growing, that means that the entrepreneurial class or the plutocratic class must have money to invest. If they have money to invest, they can only get that by getting people to buy things from them. And if you fool around with that cycle of people getting money to put into new ventures, which were then supposed to create wealth, you get this gives you a sudden burst sometimes. So for instance, in the Nazi period. They said the Nazis just simply looked at anyone who would raise their prices as enemies of the regime. So people didn't raise their prices, and at the same time, so this was very helpful because it put an end to the problem of the massive inflation. But in the long run, it meant that the people that ran businesses couldn't make money, therefore they didn't have any money for new investments, and it couldn't be sustained in the long run. So this is kind of fooling with that kind of dynamic, I think, is the heart of the Keynesian thing, which I don't because if we have a political bias, then we have to be either for or against Keynes. But of course, as Nixon said, we're all Keynesians now. So yeah, you could say, but we could go back, or you can make this kind of Judith Butler statement like, oh, we're human beings, we can make decisions, but not every thing that could be done will actually work. Just because a human decides to do it doesn't mean it will result in anything but the collapse of your country. Personally, I think a lot of the reason that Gorbachev decided to put a stop to end the Soviet thing was simply because Keynesianism was so overwhelmingly powerful after Nixon brought in the Nixon shock. Because what it meant is that basically you had unlimited leverage. The West had unlimited leverage, so it could create huge cultural and financial issues of the kind. If you want to see what the details of that means, I think of this monopoly power of unlimited leverage the West got after it went off. After it decoupled itself from the foreign exchange market. So it basically, the Nixon shock meant the U.S. dollar, which had already been made strong, of course, by Bretton Woods at the end of World War II, became infinitely stronger because it was no longer subject to the shocks of collapse of foreign currencies, such as the Turkish lira or other weak currencies. When I was young, I went to Mexico. I remember there was a collapse of the currency. But the U.S., this Nixon shock basically insulated the dollar and made it omnipotent, as it were, so that instead of a dollar, it became simply something that could be generated on a computer with the number. So going back to what we were saying, the art understood in this notion of drawing a community together links the subjective to the objective, and in this way, I suppose something like the problem of the so-called imagined communities and all that is addressed here too. But let's not go too far into that. I want to just make a formula here. There's no easy way to distinguish the borderline between taste and moral right and wrong. So this is the problem that arises with Kant's third critique, which is based on sorting out these problems, as I alluded to earlier, of what is empirical and what is not empirical, what is rational, what is conceptual, and what is belongs to the senses. And we end up based on reasoning, which has a strong, rigorous flavor to it, and is by no means accidental, and is by no means due simply to a few essential thinkers like Kant or Hegel, but has been checked and rechecked by many thousands of competent thinkers, and has a strong cogency. So the problems have a heavy gravity, is what I'm trying to say, and they're not just like due to political tides, or due to factions, or due to accidental reasons of the kind we usually get into when we try to, from a political standpoint, try to address philosophical matters. So that's partially why I would say Like, for instance, otherwise, I think um, Michael Millerman, who does Heidegger and Strauss, is pretty good, but I don't like him because he starts with the political bias, and he says things like, you know, universalism from a rightist point of view or something like that on his YouTube channel. So this I can't subscribe to. So this kind of halfway house of like, there's something that I like as a matter of taste or as a matter of moral taste, and then I try to make the philosophic problems fit to that. This is not, to me, I think, if we look at Heidegger, this is the ultimate position that doesn't have at all a political bias, whatever you would say about the Nazi period in 1933 and so on. But let's not go into trying to argue that again. But so the problem is, we can see the difference between taste. The art is, as Ms. Stewart says. So also I want to put it on the record that I'm the first to, with not a soupçon of de haut en pas, but straightforwardly taking Kristen Stewart as someone who's making her development in public, as if you like. They say that Schelling was always making his development in public because he didn't, more like myself, he didn't come to a finished position. I think with Kristen Stewart, it's more like she simply still has some part of her thinking process is still in its incomplete stages, I believe. I think there's still much more development to come, but it's not necessarily as much of a sort of dog's lunch as often happens with Schelling or myself, where we're just struggling to even get any basic coherence. It's much more aligned to a public discussion, which is taking part in constantly as a public figure. But I think we should, again, the traditional de haut en pas attitude that we apply to movie stars, we should entirely leave aside in this case. Just look at what's being discussed. So this question, we can see in connection to the Supreme Court case, we can see how this is both a moral issue, as a legal issue, as an issue of whether legal matters can be defined and therefore publicly promulgated in a way that everything can be seen. At the same time, it is a so-called, in Kantian terms, aesthetic issue, or an issue involving, I don't know, this British came out with these views about the development of the concept of a vista or a landscape, which was not, I really don't know how cogent that is, but what they say, they claim that there's at a certain time the notion of ruins became popular, the notion of vistas became popular, and that it could be demonstrated in that if you make a comparison to, say, classical literature, Roman literature, Greek literature, you can't, this concept simply doesn't exist in the same, at least not in the same way. A stronger case for this kind of conceptual lenses in which we see things, which is so strong in the headquarters of intelligence in Prussia, around, from 1800 until Heidegger and Strauss's time, which for us is very sketchy, and we can only see people like Derrida as talking about genre as something which we're a bit suspicious about. But one example of that, given in a lecture by a friend of the late Sir David Tang, I'm not sure if it appears in the channel for the foundation that he made in YouTube, but a friend of his was an art historian and a native Chinese, showed in a lecture I saw once how this concept of the British fine art came to come to power in China, so that actually became the term used for art, because historically things like flute playing were not necessarily linked up to, say, sculpture, or calligraphy was not necessarily regarded in the same breath as other forms of painting, which are myriad in the Chinese history, including a form of painting which is apparently it's not just a passing similarity, but really some of the ideas of cubism already existed in remote Chinese usage, which is interesting. But okay, so the question challenged here is how so far is knowing the situation and what is really implied by the idea of the I know it when I see it version, both of art and of morality, being promulgated in this Kristen Stewart issue still needs leave vast areas to be unthought, and tracks which can lead us to something more positive. And I end this by pointing to this article, which I've linked on my Twitter feed, but I think one can also get to it by going to Google and saying something like Chinese Foreign Ministry U.S. hegemony, where there's kind of a strong, rigorous excoriation of the arrogance of the Western position vis-a-vis the rest of the world is laid out. No mention of Russia or India is made, but there's it's been said recently that China, in giving some aid to Russia, I'm not sure if China has given aid to Russia, but if they have, this is like Roosevelt giving aid to the English right before provoking Pearl Harbor. So there may be, we're in the stages once China would be an admit to economically directly supporting Russia rather than merely abstaining from votes to condemn Russia, then you have a situation where they might also make a military footprint there. And I think this statement links very strongly to this Western position, which has become the totally arbitrary position of I know it when I see it, which means that any matter of morality or taste is then directly understood as to be subjective. The only thing that holds back from this, of course, is the skeletal features, as it were, of the old theory of physics understood as mathematical physics, understood where supposedly quantity has a special status and the status of objectivity, but quality does not. But we can see at the beginning of the tradition that Aristotle says ousia is both that the quantity is one kind of ousia and quality is another kind of ousia, but ultimately these things have a shared ground, so that it's this really doesn't hold up, but it's always in the background, and it's always somehow probably largely caught up in the swirl of the nuclear blasts at the end of World War II, had given this vast authority to the sciences as the only intellectual authority that can be fully taken seriously, and which supposedly stands back from the I know it when I see it. But I think this is obviously false, taken straightforwardly, because anything invented by the sciences is always subject to the is it something? Like, is it something? Is it valuable? Is it, what's the importance of it? And so on, which is an I know it when I see it issue, and which then raises issues such as, is the I know it when I see it somehow a collective feature of the inner liveness of groups, or is it the inner experience of groups, or the inner life of groups, or is it more to be sought in terms of, with regard to DNA tests and the notion of race, we get sort of this idea that it might just be popular because it corresponds to a certain progressive liberal taste. I don't know, but it seems to make sense scientifically, which is that there's a greater difference between individuals within racial groups, as they can be distinguished by the DNA statistically, but not by there's not a race gene that's true, just in the sense that there's a gene which tells you the eye color, but there's statistical large clusters which make up which we call race, and which we can distinguish rigorously between the Asian races and Caucasian and African, and in some other subcategories. I think Hispanic also, but that there's a greater difference within the races as defined by the evolutionary biologists and biologists in general, and biologists of medicine especially, because it plays a big role. That's where I think it gets the objective need for distinguishing the races becomes the most clear, is in biology of medicine, but that the differences between the races as a whole, understood that way, is much less than the differences between the individuals inside races, which then gives you this question of, is it rather than is the know it when I see it then Protagorean, in this sense of there's certain exceptional individuals such as Socrates which are able to discern what other individuals cannot discern, in something like the way Mozart can distinguish a delightful piece of music when he's just playing around thinking about music, or a good artist visualizing things to themselves can distinguish something that would be charming if they put it down on paper, and so on. So that there's certain personalities that do this much better than the others, and then I know it when I see it has a specific meaning in that kind of a horizon. So many questions up and up here that I think are we should try to again make into more coherent shape, and to keep an eye on.